resources to fight polarization and empower critical thinking. In this live session, we'll hear from Kamy Akhavan, the CEO of procon.org, which is the country's leading source for nonpartisan information and civic education. Procon.org serves more than 25 million people each year, and we're happy to provide Procon's resources within our Credo research platform, which is further helping researchers to easily identify reliable sources on current issues of importance. So Kamy will share the rigorous editorial process his organization undertakes to accurately represent multiple facets of complex issues. So you'll walk away today having learned strategies for drawing people out of their echo chambers, trusting open web resources for helping researchers find reliable information, and how to help students deepen critical thinking skills by recognizing bias. So we have a lot to get to, so I will now pass it over to Kamy. Kamy, take it away.
Well, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here today. Folks, it's your lunch break. Thanks for spending your lunch with me today. My name is Kamy, and it's pronounced like Tommy. It's my real name. It's short for Kambiz. I was born in Iran. I grew up in South Louisiana, and I'm calling today from Santa Monica, just north of Los Angeles. Beautiful day out here. I hope you're having a beautiful day as well. The topic I want to talk about today is about bursting the echo chamber. And the reason I've chosen this topic is because that's our specialty at Procon. For the last 14 years, organization has served over 180 million people and helped them get out of their echo chambers. A lot of us are aware sometimes that we're in those chambers. A lot of times we're not aware. Adults do it. Of course, our students do it. And we want to help all of us individually and as a society not do that so that we can gain respect for opposing views, learn empathy, sort of bring down the extremism and the divisiveness in our American politics today. We can't really function as a democracy as divided and hyperpolarized as we are, much less have good Thanksgiving meals. So we're going to fix that, or at least attempt to, and learn some strategies for how to do that today. So that's bursting the echo chamber. Now, in today's talk, we're going to talk a little bit about partisanship today and its origins and how are echo chambers formed, can they be burst, and if so, how? And then what is the role of critical thinking in bursting echo chambers? And we're going to talk about using Procon and other resources for critical thinking. This is not a Procon commercial. This is really just an earnest effort to say, like, we got problems here. How are we going to fix it? And I think teachers and librarians are a big part of that solution. And I just preface this to say, sorry, teachers, I know so much gets put on your plate. My wife is a high school English teacher in Redondo Beach, California, and I know what it's like. You have a lot of work to do for not a lot of pay, and it can be overwhelming at times. So thank you for being the soldiers for education in our country. I'm very grateful to you all. I wanted to start the talk today with this statistic, and you'll see it on the top left of your screen. It says in the 1960s, researchers asked Americans how they would feel if their son or daughter married someone of a different political ideology. At the time, this is 60s, 4% of Democrats, 5% of Republicans said they'd be displeased. So in the matter of love, it didn't really seem to matter what political party you were. Let's flash forward to 2008. Now, almost 50 years later, that number of people who'd be displeased if their son or daughter married someone of a different political ideology went up to 20% of Democrats, 27% of Republicans. Move forward just a couple of years, 2010, that number went to 33% and 49% respectively. We've come a long way, and you see the image on the right that talks about party polarization, and you can see in the House and the Senate. The chart starts right after the Civil War, and you see where it is now 2009 at the end of this chart, and party polarization is higher than it was at the time and right after the Civil War. It's really concerning, and you might feel like the folks on the bottom here where someone is shouting in your ear when you want to talk about politics. Seems like the people with the loudest voices are not always the ones who have the best opinions. What ends up happening is people get discouraged about the political process. They kind of tune out, they vote for nobody, they take pride in not participating in what they see as a dysfunctional process. And this whole lack of civic engagement sort of spirals downward, and we end up seeing where we are right now, where I live in the city of Torrance, California, We had a 9% voter turnout rate for our local municipal elections. City of Los Angeles didn't do much better. We got to 11%. It's pretty pathetic considering that's how our system of government is supposed to work. But we kind of understand it. We can see the trend lines happening. So a lot of people feel like this cartoon character does. We're hearing competing images. We're not sure how to make sense of it all. It just feels very overwhelming. And for many of us, we see the map, the U.S. political map, in one of two ways. If you're someone on the left, you might see it like this image on the left. If you're someone on the right, you might see it like someone on the right. These are maps that come from the moral psychologist, Dr. Jonathan Haidt, so no offenses intended. This is just perceptions about how people see the country. And you may see it the way that your own personal ideologies reinforce. So first of all, I know that there is an opportunity for a poll here, and I believe Olga and Kristen from Credo Reference have a poll. I wanted to, was curious about how many people, before we really get into this, are familiar with pro-con. And if you don't mind taking a few seconds to answer that poll question, just curious, see if you're familiar with this organization and our work. And then we'll have a second poll question for you, just a few. The first slide that we want to look at here as we get into the meat of our conversation is about how voters get educated. This is important when we talk about how political ideologies are formed. When we look at how voters get educated, ourselves included, we're talking about cable television news. You can see 24% of the American public in the 2016 presidential election learned about the election from political ads. And now that statistic is cable news comes first, what's second? Social media, then local TV, then news websites. TV basically dominates. Between cable TV and local TV, it is the largest portion of how voters get educated.
So Kamy, we have the results from our first poll. So for folks who have used procon.org, we've got a good split. We've got about 48% of the audience who have, about 28% who haven't, and 23% who haven't heard about procon.org yet. So some great opportunity here to provide that extra resource for folks.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that.
And we can move on to the second poll just to give you an idea on our second discussion, which is, do you discuss or do you have discussions about controversial issues with your students? So you can give everybody a second to chime in on that too, so you can speak to that in your discussion as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important question about whether or not you as teachers do talk about controversy in the classroom, whether you're comfortable doing that, whether you feel it's appropriate, whether you feel supported by your administration, or whether you feel your community is promoting those kinds of conversations or not. I'm really curious about that. We've gotten very different responses from different parts of the country when we ask that question. So it looks like
we've got about 63% who say somewhat, only 23% who say frequently, and 13% who said they don't talk about it.
That is a fairly typical result there. We have some teachers, depending on where in the country, they really feel uncomfortable talking about controversy in the classroom, particularly current events, particularly in today's political climate, feel there's too much backlash, it's not worth it. Whereas other teachers are like, look, we have to do this. This is perhaps one of our most important roles as educators. And we'll get into that. We'll talk about that for sure. But thank you for responding in those two polls. So looking at this slide, we know that voters are getting their education primarily from television, and social media has an increasing role in this, and that is our reality for today. What's interesting is how people get informed. So when I grew up in a town called Opelousas in southern Louisiana, we had one news channel, and in a city like mine where there's very little diversity in news, then people in my community would most likely reflect the values that they're seeing on television, because that's where they're getting their news. If you live in a large city like I do now in Los Angeles or Chicago, New York, or any number of big cities in the US, then it's more likely that the person will be exposed to multiple points of view and that those viewpoints will become more centrist. Something about exposure brings people more into the middle. whereas the lack of exposure keeps people on the fringes. What I find particularly troubling is most people live in congressional districts and voting districts where they don't have lots of media options, at least not in their local news. And what is happening now, because of gerrymandering, because of our self-sorting, people moving into communities that reflect their own ideologies, because of people unfriending on social media, because people are going more and more into their echo chambers, we're seeing that this partisan divide within our country is increasing, as we saw in earlier slides, but it's increasing so much that this bottom stat should really scare us all. Out of the 435 House districts, these congressional districts, 26 of them are considered competitive, where the outcome is not predictable. Most of the districts are drawn in a way to where we know it's going to be a Republican, we just don't know which one, or we know it's going to be a Democrat, we just don't know which one. Certainly the case here for me in Southern California. Depending on where you live, it's going to be a Democrat. Where I grew up in Louisiana, it's going to be a Republican, we just don't know which. So the magic of democracy in the United States is happening in about 5% of our congressional districts. It's a really troubling stat. Can we expect the media to never spread fake news? We hear that term often. A great quote from Jonathan Swift that's been repeated many times in different forms, from Mark Twain to contemporary political pundits. But he says, falsehood flies and the truth comes limping after it. Fake news and propaganda were rampant in the 1930s, as they are now. This is the Aspen Institute saying that. Fake news has always been around. It is not a new phenomenon. It's certainly a much talked about phenomenon now, but it's not new. It's been happening since Jonathan Swift and before. And this Weekly World News headline article, real article about Hillary Clinton's adopted alien baby, obviously fake news, just an emblem of the kind of media landscape we're living in now. What's interesting is that even though we saw that Hillary Clinton cover on the Weekly World News, and you say, oh, that's obviously not a correct fact, what's really interesting is that facts may not matter. And what I mean by that is a guy named Brendan Nyhan, he's a researcher at the University of Michigan, probably the most famous of all researchers in looking at fake news and people's personal biases and where they come from. He said that when misinformed people, particularly people who are politically partisan, they were exposed to corrected facts in the news stories. When they were exposed to the corrected facts, they didn't say, oops, my bad, I guess I got that wrong. What happened is they rarely changed their minds. They doubled down and became more strongly set in their beliefs. They called this effect the backfire effect. And it's to the point where some folks are afraid to introduce facts because they don't want the folks who are wrong to double down and dig in and stick with their wrong ideologies. So just confronting someone with facts may not move them away from their position. We'd like to think that it can, but we know that it doesn't. So facts counterintuitively could make misinformation stronger. That's not to say that we shouldn't share facts. Of course we should. But we have to do it in a particular way, or we may produce the backfire effect. So that's a big problem, but the problem is even worse than that. So I'll share this example. 1,000 Iowans were given a quiz on welfare. Now, Iowa is one of the first states in the nation for political primaries. They have a higher level of political IQ than folks in many other states because they're constantly exposed to candidates coming through their state to win their votes. When these Iowans were given the quiz on welfare, more than half of them were confident, 50% were confident that all their answers were correct. 3%, however, got more than half of them right. Can you imagine that in your classrooms? Half your students are confident that all their answers are correct, and yet 3% get more than half right. It's a huge discrepancy, right, between the ones who were confident they were right. What's interesting is the ones who were the most confident they were right were the ones who knew the least about welfare. And it's hard to be optimistic about the effectiveness of fact-checking in this kind of environment. People tend to interpret information with an eye towards reinforcing their pre-existing views. This is called, as you know, it's called motivated reasoning, or it's called confirmation bias. I have some books behind me. This book, The Righteous Mind, perhaps the most famous book written about confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. It's by Jonathan Haidt, and it's terrific. But motivated reasoning and confirmation bias, these are very natural things that people do, confirming their own ideologies, and that's what drives people into the echo chambers, and it's what's happening now at unprecedented levels. That's where we are today, folks. We like to think, well, that's true of the rest of the country, but not true about me. I've got a master's, or I have a PhD, or I went to school for this long, or I'm really challenging myself all the time. What about smart folks? Well, sadly, politically sophisticated thinkers were even less open to new information. They might be right about 90% of things, but their confidence makes it nearly impossible to correct the 10% on which they're totally wrong. In the famous Tabor and Lodge study, the most sophisticated people had double the resistance to facts compared to the average. And just a couple examples, there's highly educated, left-leaning Marin County, so north of San Francisco, Marin County moms insisting that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine may cause autism. It doesn't cause autism. It has never been proven to cause autism. It's been flatly rejected by study after study after study, but they insist that it may cause autism. It doesn't. Counterpoint, highly educated, right-leaning Americans insisting that scientists are divided about whether or not humans have influenced climate change. Scientists are not divided about this. That's not correct, but they insist, even though they're highly educated. So it goes both ways. People can really dig in, even if they're especially smart. So why are we so deceived? Argue it's nature. We're hardwired that way. There's plenty of neuroscientific studies about the fact that we may be hardwired for political ideologies. We have 20 of them listed on the Procon site, peer-reviewed studies. It's really fascinating. Or it's nurture. We reflect our parents' ideologies. We reflect our community's ideologies. That nurture is driving it. Or it's the cable news media. We're sort of being manipulated by media. Or it's the lying politicians. They're tricking and deceiving us. Or social media. It's social media that's driving us into our echo chambers. It's bad actors trying to mislead us. All of these things are part of it for sure, but it's mostly what we talked about. It's confirmation bias. It's motivated reasoning. It's this inherent human trait, this desire to confirm our own bias. And the way to do that without critical thinking and exposure to respectfully presented opposing views, this hardwired trait goes unchallenged. Think about it as the confirmation bias, this motivated reasoning, that it is an elephant and that we are sitting on top of this elephant that wants to do what it wants to do, and somehow we are the jockeys. We have to try to control it and make it go where we want it to go. It's awfully hard to do, but when you use that visual, and it's not my visual, again, it's Dr. Haidt's visual here, we are the elephant jockeys, and we are trying to ride our confirmation bias and steer our elephant so that we can be in control. Okay, so I've shared a lot of studies, shared a lot of statistics, talked about political ideologies and their formations and influences, but so what? You may think like my wife does, look, I'm a teacher, took a low-paying, insanely demanding job to serve an important mission, better educate people in this country. Okay, understanding hardwired versus learned behaviors and riding elephants, how's that going to help me? All right, fair enough. Because critical thinking, that's the answer, because of that. Teachers are the masters of passing down this essential skill. It is our duty, it is our burden, and we got to do it, folks. We have to do it. It's perhaps the most important thing. In fact, when there was a survey done of over 1,100 teachers here in California, the California Teachers Association, and they asked the teachers, what's the #1 most important life skill, career skill, and well, those two skills that you could teach your students, and they said #1 is critical thinking. So I know you're with me on this. So critical thinking to the rescue. Now, what is it? Brendan Nyhan, this famous Michigan researcher, suggests that instead of focusing on citizens and consumers of information, we need to look at the suppliers of the misinformation and the sources. We need to think about sources of information and challenge the sources, expose the sources, be aware that sources have a point of view. And in your classrooms, you probably do that too. Is this source on the left? Is this source on the right? What are those sources' credentials? Does that source have a reason to have a biased perspective on this, or does the source have a reason to be neutral on these issues? And be mindful of those things when looking at information. So when we think big picture about critical thinking and what we're doing in the classroom, we're thinking a lot about the future of our country. At least I do, and I know you do too. So we're all concerned about this. How are we going to fix this? What are we going to do? Perhaps one of the most important things we can do is create these respectful learning and discussion spaces. Doesn't mean it's a safe space. In fact, it could be quite the opposite. This is a space where we want people to be challenged. We want people to be exposed to contrary points of view, but we want to do it in a very respectful way. So part of the thinking is that self-esteem is a factor in how people's ideologies are changed. If you feel good about yourself, you'll consider contrary perspectives. If you feel threatened or insecure, you won't listen to contrary perspectives. You'll feel attacked and feel like no one listens to you, no one cares about your viewpoints, and so you won't be open. So by creating a respectful classroom space and helping people feel comfortable, then they can kind of open up and share what they really think, and they will have to be vulnerable in order to do that and be honest. And those are hard things to achieve, but I know good teachers do that all day long. So we want those respectful learning spaces. Another quick tactic that you could use is ask the question and give related information right away. So this, what you see on the slide in front of you now, this is from a study. This was really done. Group 1 was asked, what percentage of the federal budget is and should be spent on welfare? People who respond to that question, they gave high is numbers and the low should be numbers. There's a gap of 20%. So when asked this open question, what percentage of the budget is and should be spent on welfare, we had a gap of 20%. Now, group 2, they were told that 1% of the budget is spent on welfare. They had that as an anchor, a bit of information. Then they were asked what percentage of the federal budget should be spent on welfare. When given the anchoring fact and then asked that open question, the response for group 2 produced a gap of 7%, a much smaller difference, because they knew how much was spent on welfare. So it's important when you ask a critical question, an open question, sometimes it's very useful to provide an anchoring fact. What works best in the classrooms? You will know best intuitively because you will have seen the results, but from our point of view, these are some things that do work well. Teach listening, point of view. People have points of view. We want our students to be aware of that. Want to discuss and explore these controversial social issues in your classroom. We'll talk more about why that's so important. Want to show the sources, question the sources, challenge the sources. Want to give contextual facts, like we talked about in that last example, an anchoring fact maybe. Want to stimulate critical thinking in the classroom using all the tools that we know to stimulate critical thinking. We want these conversations to feel like an earnest coffee talk. You know, when you sit across from one of your good friends and you're having coffee and you're really making eye contact, you're engaged, you're listening, you're not waiting to speak, you're listening and then responding to what the other person said. It's an earnest two-way exchange. We want conversations to feel that way rather than the Thanksgiving dinner where it's monologue, monologue, monologue. You are a murderer because you're eating the turkey. I can't believe racist Uncle Hal just said that. I'm out of here. My family's awful. I'll go in my room and cry. We don't want it obviously like that. We want the coffee talk. Another thing that works well is when we're presenting data and information and research, we want to aggregate the data. That's one thing. Bring it together. That's important. But also importantly, sort the data. That is kind of curating. That's the function. Aggregating is difficult, but not that difficult. It's the sorting and the curating. That's the magic. And the more that we do that in presenting information to students, I think the better for them. We can also offer comprehensive information in simple formats. And this is not just an opinion. There's so many studies that talk about the format of the information that's presented, using bullet points, using lists, doing pro-con columns, numbering, bolding thesis statements, these kinds of simple things, formatting, of all things, formatting, right? Formatting matters. So presenting it in a simple, digestible format, that really helps people engage with the content that we want them to think about. So what are some expectations I have? We can't expect kids to understand their society if we don't talk about what happens in it. Obviously, when they graduate, they're going to be voting, yikes, and if they don't understand how our world works, then we can't expect them to make good decisions as citizens and as voters. So my opinion, and I know a lot of you share this, that's why you're on this call today, is politics should not be taboo. And they said, you know what, 2 things you should never talk about? It's religion, and politics. That's bad advice. Of course we should talk about religion and politics. That's how we're going to solve these kinds of issues. People are afraid to discuss social issues in public, and unless we can have respectful, productive talks on important topics, we'll doom ourselves to gridlock. Talking about and teaching controversial issues will help teach critical thinking and encourage civic participation. Bottom line, it's uncomfortable, but we got to do it, because what's going to expose people to different points of view, it's making them uncomfortable, and there needs to be some element of that, honestly. So what's the cavalry coming over the hill? How are we going to fix this? Well, good news is that we have the National Council for the Social Studies, the National Council for Teachers of English, and the National Math and Science Initiative. All three of these bodies have now really embraced the notion of critical thinking and cooked them into their standards. So we know that this is happening across the national education landscape, but that happens up there. What about when it comes down into your individual classroom, when the door is closed, assuming you don't have a camera in the class, doors closed, what are you doing in the class? Teachers are more eager to participate and bring critical thinking into their students, because you personally see the value and you personally see the outcome of what happens when you don't teach it. So there's some resources that I personally really like to use, and all of these sources come down to the basic fact in my mind is exposure. We have to show people that not everyone thinks like them, and exposure can be balanced, and we want to show them different points of view. So who can do that? Well, debate organizations. They're geared and designed to do that. Junior Statesmen of America, it's a terrific organization, nonprofit, free, nonpartisan, great. The Reagan Library, you may think Ronald Reagan, he's a Republican, that's biased. Ronald Reagan Library actually has some excellent educational resources, totally nonpartisan, and nothing to do with Reagan really. They're all about teaching civics education. They're terrific. Credo, I honestly think Credo is terrific. They have such a vast library of data and information and support materials, and integrating it into curricula in ways that I find really, really useful. Constitutional Rights Foundation, they do mock trials and organize them across the country, but they also have information on controversial issues. MICVA Challenge and Action Civics LA, there's an Action Civics in DC, and MICVA Challenge is based in Chicago. This organization helps with youth empowerment. They help them take action in their own communities based on what they learn through the organization. There's NAMELY, the National Association of Media Literacy Educators, and then related to NAMELY is the News Literacy Project. These are teaching people and students, particularly, media literacy skills, how to identify if an article is well written or not well written, is the source biased or not biased, and kind of how to be critical as media consumers. Books for personal growth, I say that because all of us have our own journey to disrupt our own confirmation biases and our own motivated reasoning. And so to help us get out of our own echo chambers, we can do all of these things, but who's going to teach us? And a lot of times we have to teach ourselves. And so this is just a list of some of the books that I really like a lot. And there's a couple here that I wanted to highlight. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He won a Nobel Prize, which was rare considering that he's a psychologist, and he won the Nobel Prize in economics. It's really a well-written book. This book is not on my list. I also think it's terrific. It's called We Need to Talk by Celeste Headlee. You can look up her TED Talk, Celeste Headlee TED Talk, and it's about 10 minutes long, and it's basically conversations, do's and don'ts, and it's, I think, the third most viewed TED Talk ever. Anyway, these are good ones. Here we have some motivational quotes. Not that you need the motivation, but if it's useful, just know that it's there. My favorite is this middle one from Sandra Day O'Connor. She says, knowledge about our government is not handed down through the gene pool. Every generation has to learn it. And being mindful of that, I think, is so important, that it's a constant cycle, constantly putting information in the heads of our students so that they can go out and help our society and us thrive. We talked about confirmation bias. I showed you Dr. Haidt's book. I just wanted to share this because personally I thought it was awesome. Dr. Haidt sent Procon a note and without solicitation said that Procon was the best antidote to confirmation bias that he had ever seen. We're of course thrilled because he's the master of confirmation bias and its study, and to have Dr. Haidt say that about Procon, I thought was wonderful. So just know that using Procon, you'll you'll be using one of the top sources to disrupt confirmation bias. I'll talk a little bit about ProCon, and then I'm very interested in a Q&A. So ProCon is research developed in-house by professional researchers. These are folks who have PhD degrees, some work for CNN, some work for different media organizations, professors. It's not wiki anything. This is all produced in-house. Research goes through 7 scrubs before we publish anything. That means it starts with a researcher, it goes to an associate editor, it goes to a peer review process, it goes to external parties, depending on the topic. We're going to write to 15 experts in the field on all across the spectrum and ask them to take shots at the information that we're presenting, to come back in-house with the researcher, peer review process, copy editor, published. It is insanely laborious. It takes a lot of time, 400 hours for one topic to do the research for that. We do all of that so that we know that the information that you get at ProCon is going to be the top quality research, unbiased, best. So what you're looking at now is a screenshot from our homepage. You can see there's a lot of topics here. We have 70+ topics right now. What I'm showing you now is a screenshot from just an example of one topic. This is about animal research. This was especially popular with middle school teachers. They asked us, begged us to do one on animal testing. It's one of our most popular topics, but it's also very useful for adults, college students, anyone. The research is tiered. It's designed to be used at elementary, middle school, high school, college, and then of course top policy circles as well. ProCon has been referenced by 35 state governments. It's been cited by 17 state departments of education. We've been cited by 22 international governments, including the United Nations and the World Health Organization and the European Union. So it's all levels of the spectrum. So what you see here now is the animal testing. You see the pro and the con. You see how it's structured. We have a pro 1, con 1. There's a bolded thesis statement. There's 2 columns. It's immediately apparent that there's more than one perspective being shared here. In addition to the arguments that we present on the ProCon site, we also present quotes. It just adds a different flavor, a different perspective. And for every quote that we use on the site, we produce the corresponding biography of the person who provided that quote. So you may read the first one and say, Lindsay Marshall, PhD, says whatever about animal testing, and you think, well, that's great, but who's Lindsay Marshall? What do I care? Oh, there's Lindsay Marshall. Oh, she's the science communications officer. She was a senior lecturer. She has a PhD in biology, on and on. You can judge for yourself. It helps with what we talked about earlier. Look at the source. Talked about aggregate and sort. This is a screenshot from our election coverage. We did this for the 2016 election. So we've aggregated here the positions of these presidential candidates on the issue of whether or not the U.S. should maintain its embargo against Cuba. This first portion you see is, at a glance, you can see where people fall. Who's pro, who's con, who's not clear on the issue, somewhere in between pro and con. But if you want to read their quotes, of course you can. And if someone had a position change, you can see the quote that says now con or now pro, and you can click that and you can see their former position. Not a flip-flop, just former position. So this is aggregated and sorted as an example of what I mean. What does ProCon do? Train teachers, we engage voters, we obviously provide research, we moderate debates, we do live events, raise public awareness about these issues. We typically are the first, second, or third result you'll see in Google for these searches. We write articles. We're a Google News provider. You'll see our articles right next to New York Times, Time Magazine, etc. Teach students. We do critical thinking seminars. Happy to do them. If you happen to be local, great. If you want to fly us out to your community, happy to do it in person at your school as well. And of course, we create lesson plans. We've got about 50 or so lesson plans on the ProCon site. They're all free of charge. Go for it. Have at it. We'll show you how it ties to Common Core. We'll show how it ties to various other teaching standards. And hope that's, of course, useful to you. And why is it that we're doing all this through critical thinking being critically important? We talked about how number 3, California teachers said critical thinking skills were the #1 measure of college and career readiness. There was a study done of UCLA. 11,000 UCLA graduates asked what was the most important skill you learned in school. Critical thinking was the second most important skill after interpersonal skill. Their degree was way down the list, but critical thinking was number 2. Several reasons here you can see. What I really want to highlight is number 7 and 8. 98% of teachers surveyed said that using ProCon helped improve their critical thinking skills. And number 8 is 36% of the ProCon users said they changed their opinion based on what they learned at ProCon. Changing opinions is obviously not easy to do, and here we are doing it through information. And really, folks, it's all about exposure to different points of view. That's all I have for now. So I just want to say thank you again for spending your lunch with me. I'm happy to answer questions about organization, our work, critical thinking, any of our topics. I'm available to you personally. You can call ProCon. I will personally answer the phone when you call, or someone will hand the phone to me. If you write, it's Kamy, K-A-M-Y, @procon.org. Happy to correspond with you. We encourage you to keep in touch with us. We want this to be a two-way communication, suggestions, advice, insights for us. Please pass them along. Otherwise, I encourage you to consider becoming members at ProCon. ProCon is, of course, free, but we are a nonprofit public charity. We ask for donations. If you're interested in supporting us, please consider becoming a member. Otherwise, I'm really grateful for your time today. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Kamy. That was excellent. And I do just want to put a note out to everyone out there. If you are a Credo customer and using Credo Online Reference Service, we're really proud to be sponsors of ProCon as well and have much of their content within the platform for free and available for your students. So a lot of those controversial talks are readily available in the platform for them to look at. So just taking a look at some of the questions that came through, Kamy, I'm going to put these over to you. We actually did have a few people submit questions ahead of the conference, or sorry, ahead of the session. So I'll go through those first. So one audience member says, according to Wikipedia, one study suggested that fewer than 2% of factually flawed articles in daily newspapers are actually followed by a correction. Is there an easy-to-go place a person can go online in order to see the policies of all the various news organizations and websites when it comes to making corrections?
You know, it's a great question. And the short answer to it is I'm not aware of it. I've seen different products along the way. There's one, a browser extension called Civic Owl. I'm not sure how good it is. There's one website called allsides.com where they use user-generated input where people who use that All-Sides product can say whether they think the source is biased. Their site does it by publication, so rather than particular articles. So for example, if Charles Krauthammer, who is very right, publishes an article in the New York Times, which is left, then the All-Sides platform will say this article is left because it came from the New York Times, when obviously it's not, because Charles Krauthammer couldn't be more right. So that's an example. So the bottom line is, I wish there were something that were really that useful to where it can identify the sources for us. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist. However, we've got the best source available, and it's our own critical thinking skills. So when we look at an article and we look at their choice of words, we look at what's included or what's not included in the article, we look at who they're citing within the article. Those things obviously give us clues, and I know you know this stuff, but for me, there's many publications I'm exposed to that I don't know who the heck they are. I don't know how to assess them, so I'll just read the article for myself and try to figure out, are they left, right, neutral, somewhere in the middle, rather than rely on a third-party source where I would also have to look at, hey, is that third-party source reliable, left, right, neutral, or whatever. So for me, I like using my own analysis to make the determination rather than relying on a third party. But I wish there was a great one I could recommend for you, and I'm sorry that I can't.
All right, and if TV news is the primary means of learning for voters and the number of folks who actually watch TV is declining, where do you think information should be posted?
Well, it should be posted in all of these media. So it should be posted on television, it should be posted on social media, it should be posted in print, and it should be shared in conversation, it should be shared on radio, all of those things. The problem, however, is as media consolidation limits the diversity of perspective, and as social media tends to reinforce ideologies, and I'll give an example. So in the 2016 election, I had many friends who were championing Hillary Clinton. And whenever they would like a speech from Hillary Clinton, the Facebook algorithm and the Instagram algorithm was designed to say, oh, this person likes Hillary Clinton, so I'm going to share more friends' feeds who also like Hillary Clinton because they're more likely to like that. Or when someone else shares something about Hillary Clinton, I'm going to make sure that it shows up on this person's profile because they're more likely to be interested in it. And So the person who clicked like on the Hillary Clinton video may have done it just because they liked it. They didn't realize that what they were signing up for was a limitation and an exclusion of other competing voices and other contrary perspectives, because the system is designed to just give them what they think the person wants. So social media is really bad at doing that. And one way to get around it is either follow this whole convoluted process of trying to undo all the things in the privacy settings and the data settings to make sure that it's not restricting what it is that you look at. Or you maybe like something that you don't like in your heart, but you like it for the purpose of telling that social media platform, I still want to see this stuff. It's still important that I understand how other people think, even if I personally find it distasteful. I just want to know how other people think about this. So that's one tactic. But the bottom line to your question is, we're going to see social media start to rise, particularly video within social media. So think YouTube, which is now one of the top 3 search engines. We don't think about YouTube as a search engine. I don't, but it's now one of the top 3 search engines in the country because of the young people and their use of it. So we're going to see social media, particularly video, start to rise, and it's going to remain a visual platform. So TV will transition into more of these bite-sized pieces, and we're going to see the proliferation of that style of information sharing as we go forward. So for all of us, I think we just need to be mindful of that, that it will remain visual, but it's going to be far more dispersible because of how it's promoted via social.
And Kamy, throughout your presentation, you had a lot of really great quotes and discussion points, and we have had requests for some of the references. So we will make these slides available to folks after the presentation. So if you're interested in the presentation, just note that in the follow-up survey. But would you be able to provide a list of references as well, so if people want to look into some things a bit more?
Oh, for sure. I hope that I have included the reference within the slide, and if I haven't, then I'm happy to share it. Yeah, and all of the stuff I'm talking about, it didn't take me long to find it. Like quoting Brendan Nyhan, quoting Jonathan Haidt, they're very prominent folks in their field, and there's so much more in this genre, and that more that has been emerging over the course of the last few years. But bottom line is, I'm happy to share it for sure.
Excellent. Couple more questions for you, so sit tight. Sometimes there aren't 2 sides to an issue. How do you deal with that at ProCon?
It's a great point, and we have one of our frequently asked questions ask that very question. We're very transparent. You'll see that we ask every challenging question for ProCon, and we put it right on the site so people can understand our responses. Every single person who's given even $1 to ProCon is listed on the site, so we can be transparent in who we are as an organization too. But to your point, an issue may have obviously more than 2 points of view, a pro and a con. So what we try to do is we ask a very specific question. It doesn't just say animal testing, pro or con. It will ask a very specific question. Should animal testing be legal? And in that way, we can refine the argumentation. And when we're looking at the pros and the cons, we'll find that there's a great diversity of pros and a great diversity of cons. And so they basically fall into one camp or the other. And if we cannot put it into one of those 2 camps, that's okay. We have a different place on the site for that. So for every topic at ProCon, there's the arguments, we know, the pro and the con. There's the quotes in a pro and a con format. We have historical timelines and backgrounds where a lot of this historical information, which doesn't fit neatly into a pro or con, we want that there. We want people to understand the context and the history and the background of so many of these issues. So we've provided that for our audience as well. Bottom line is, I think you're going to find that when you start reading the pros and the cons, you're going to get the whole picture. We're calling it ProCon because we want it to be simple, and we want people to understand that if you just think about it as I'm getting immediately a different point of view, not just because they're telling me I am, because I can literally see it, then I think that visual structure is very appealing for people. When you look at a newspaper article, or even online, you have to start here and go to the bottom and read that whole thing to figure out if you're getting more than one point of view. Whereas in this particular format, it's immediately apparent. There's a pro, there's a con. So that's why we've chosen that format, is this basic relief, this issue is not daunting, this issue can be broken down, this issue is specific, this issue is digestible. But within that structure, and to your point, all of the nuance of the issues and all the perspective on that, all that stuff gets cooked in, but we still keep it in those two formats. And where we can't, we put it in these other areas.
Great. And what are pro-cons epistemological assumptions? Is truth ultimately objective, subjective, relative, etc.?
It's a good question, and the bottom line of it for me is, I don't know. I'm not smart enough to have an epistemological assumption in what I'm doing, or at least be aware that I have one. The way I think about pro-con is, these issues are hard. Should marijuana be legalized? I don't know. It's a tough issue. When the organization was founded, it was founded because the founder's friend had a terminal illness, and his friends were saying, Peter, you ought to use marijuana. It's going to help increase your appetite. It's going to let you live longer. You're going to be happier. And other friends were saying, Peter, it's a terrible idea. It's illegal. You're going to get in trouble. You're going to compromise your health. You're going to die sooner. Don't do it. So our founder said, you know what, Peter, I love you. I care about you. I want to make sure that you get really great information, not just anecdotal information, top research, and I'm going to present it on this new thing called the internet, so I don't have to call you all the time or email you all the time. You can just look at this pro and con research at your leisure. Whenever it's convenient for you, do it. So for Peter, he was making major life decisions about his health based on the research that he was looking at. And bottom line, for me, pro-con is very practical that way. The assumption that I put into it is I'm assuming that people are like me, they're like you, they want to understand these issues better, but we find it awfully hard to do it. We don't have the time in our lives. We got enough distractions in our lives. We got enough things to worry about. I don't have 400 hours to personally spend digging into an issue. So wouldn't it be great if someone could do that for me, and if that someone were a team of top researchers, and wouldn't it be great if they also did it at no cost, and they also provided all this contextual information, and they did it with no intention of bias, and with a mission to be completely nonpartisan and antiseptically neutral. I think most of us would say, hooray, we really want that. Well, that's what pro-con is. And so I don't mean to duck and dodge your question, but the bottom line of it is I don't think about it that way about epistemological assumptions. I just think this is practical, people need it, and that's the audience that we're trying to serve.
All right. Do you find generational differences in the success of your efforts?
I think the answer is yes, but I'll hedge a bit. So the bulk of our audience are students. So 40% of the 25 million people that we serve every year, 40% of them are students. So these are people who are 25 years old and younger. So for them, they're using pro-con because they have to. Either their teacher said, use pro-con, or because the teacher said, I need you to do a controversial issue paper, or I want you to do an essay on the social topic, or I'm just doing research on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they happen to come across pro-con. So students are using it because they have to, and they did it specifically because they were directed there, or because they happen to find us in their Google search. That's our marketing strategy. We want to be very visible in the search engines. That said, 60% of our audience are not students. They're older than the age of 25. And after you get to 25 and up, it's really diversified across age buckets. And that to me is really, really interesting because we're finding that people attach themselves and gravitate towards certain topics based on where they are in their lives. So an example, we have the topic of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Young people are using that because they have to in classrooms, but guess who else is doing it? People who are in their 70s, 80s, 90s, who have a very poor quality of life and are wondering, what can I do? Is this an option for me? I can't tell you how many times I get calls at least once a week from someone who says, is it legal in my state? What are the residency requirements? Can I just go to Oregon and have a doctor end my life? I'm miserable. And of course, our answer is you need to talk to your physician. We can't give medical or legal advice. However, we can direct you to our chart of all the state laws on physician aid and dying, and it does establish what the laws are, what are the residency requirements, how many doctors need to sign off on this, do you need a psychiatric evaluation, et cetera, et cetera. And so for that age group, they're looking at the issue for a very different perspective than someone who is in their teens and 20s. And that's just one example. For so many different issues, it has a very distinct audience for each one of those. So it really serves audiences across the spectrum, but skewing younger.
And when a pro-con issue is posted, does it then get revised or updated with new information if the issue is settled or things change?
I love that question. The answer is yes. And I love that I can say yes, and at the same time, it is so difficult. So for instance, if you typed in the phrase gay marriage into Google 5 years ago, Procon was the #1 site that came up. That means when people are looking for that subject, information on that topic, they expect us to be neutral, they expect us to be current. We have an obligation to make sure that people are being informed in the best way. So we devoted considerable resources internally to making sure that site was always constantly updated to the minute. If anything changed, we updated the site. What did that mean? And as you recall, state laws started to change a lot. We're updating our state laws page, updating our historical timelines. New studies were coming out, new information was coming out, new quotes. People were talking about it, constantly updating the site. We did that several times a day on just that one topic. We do the same thing on our medical marijuana site. Our site has been referenced now by everyone at that site, from the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Office of National Drug Control Policy to patient advocacy groups, Americans for Safe Access, the NORML and Marijuana Policy Project. They rely on us to be the front line of the research gathering. So we're constantly updating all of our topics, and with 70 topics, you can imagine it is a difficult burden for us to attain, but it's one we've committed ourselves to. That's why Procon is that resource for people. It's current, it's high quality, and that's our problem. Your only problem is, how can I get there? And just type in procon.org, or you go to Credo and you get the Procon resources from there. And what I like about access through Credo is we don't provide the same type of curricular support and structure that you can find whenever it's in the Credo universe. So it's a different kind of experience. And as an educator, honestly, I'm not discouraging from using Procon. I think the environment that Credo offers is better for educators because it is more integrated for your needs specifically, whereas our presentation is geared more for the public, everybody, not necessarily just educators.
Great, and we're running up against time, so we have a few more questions, but we're going to shoot those over to you, Kamy. If you can respond to folks directly, that would be really helpful. But want to thank you again for today's session. This was excellent.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thanks for spending your lunch with me. You really, I'm honored and flattered that you chose to do that. And please do keep in touch. I really want to maintain contact with everyone who took the time to do this, and respect that with my time to you as well. Best of luck with your instructions. Keep talking about controversy and issues in the classroom. If you don't do it, folks, if you don't teach your students these kinds of skills, then yikes for the country. So appreciate those of you who are doing it, and if you're not doing it, start doing it. And thanks for using Procon.
All right, folks, and so if you like today's session, Kamy, I'm going to ask you to just go to the next slide. We do have another webinar coming up. So I would encourage you to join us on October 18th. We're actually going to be hosting a webinar with the Charleston Conference. We're going to be joined by Texas A&M University's Instructional Services Librarian, Emily Metcalf, who's going to be speaking with Credo about strategies librarians can use to deepen their IL programs by flipping instruction, focusing more on active learning with students, and using assessments to collect evidence of the positive impact IL instruction has on student success. So another great one. Stay tuned, and stay tuned for more Credo webinars. As a reminder, there will be a recording of this one shared within 24 hours, so you can share that with your colleagues if you please. There will also be a short survey shared directly after the webinar and via email if you don't have the time to complete it now. So thank you again, everybody, and have an excellent afternoon.